A woman gave food to a beggar, unaware he held $1 billion secret in disguise. The city shimmered beneath the afternoon sun, its glass towers casting long reflections across the polished streets. Luxury cars glided past, their chrome gleaming, and well-dressed men and women hurried to business meetings, lunches, and endless engagements that kept the machine of the metropolis turning. In the center of it all was David Cole, a man whose very name carried weight. Billionaire, visionary, the man who had turned a modest family business into an empire. His face appeared on magazine covers and financial journals, his presence expected. At galas, boardrooms, and charity banquets. Yet, even in the midst of this grandeur, David felt a silence inside him. His life, for all its glitter and polish, had become a stage play. Women smiled at him, but their eyes often wandered to the car he drove, the watch he wore, the wealth he represented. Friends lingered around him, but too often their loyalty was tied to the opportunities his empire could provide. Standing before the tinted glass of his skyscraper office, David looked out at the endless horizon and exhaled deeply. The wealth had built walls around him, shiny, impenetrable walls that few dared to cross for who he truly was. He longed, in a way that startled him, for something simple, something pure. And so, on that bright afternoon, David made a decision that no one would have expected from a man of his stature. He stripped away the symbols of his empire. The tailored suit was exchanged for ragged trousers, faded and frayed at the edges. His polished shoes were replaced by worn sneakers, the kind whose soles had seen years of pavement. He covered his body with a dull, oversized coat and left his watch, his cufflinks, and his sleek leather wallet in the safe. When he looked in the mirror, he saw someone unrecognizable, a beggar. A man most of the city would step over without a second glance. The disguise made him anonymous, invisible. For the first time in years, no one would point, whisper, or calculate his worth. Strangely, that anonymity felt like a kind of freedom. He stepped into the streets. The sun was still high, bouncing off car windows, making the sidewalks nearly too bright to bear. But for David, it felt like a new world. People brushed past him without care. Some glanced and looked away, their eyes sliding past as though he were a shadow. A woman clutched her handbag a little tighter as she walked by. A man muttered under his breath, "Get a job," before moving on. Each reaction cut him, but each also revealed the truth of how the world saw those without power, without wealth, without polish. David's heart sank, yet at the same time he felt strangely alive. The trappings of his old life, the attention, the applause, the admiration, had always been conditional. But here, stripped of it all, he could see people for who they were. And perhaps, just perhaps, someone might see him. Hours passed as he wandered the streets. He leaned against a fountain, letting the spray mist across his face, feeling the grit of the stone beneath his palm. Around him, pigeons picked at crumbs, and people dropped coins into the cup of a man sitting a few feet away. David pulled the collar of his coat tighter, whispering under his breath words that had lingered in his heart for years. "If she sees me here, then I'll know." The words were quiet, almost a prayer. He wasn't sure to whom he spoke, to himself, to fate, or to some force greater than both. But the decision was made. He would stay hidden in plain sight. He would walk these streets not as the billionaire everyone envied, but as a man stripped of his empire. Somewhere in this city, he hoped, there was a woman whose eyes would not stop at the clothes he wore, nor measure him by the weight of his wallet. Somewhere, perhaps, someone would look at him and see a man. Just a man. And until that day came, David would remain in his disguise, watching, waiting, believing that true love was not blind, but it was brave enough to see past appearances. The square was alive with motion, a hive of activity under the merciless afternoon sun. Street vendors shouted over one another, peddling roasted peanuts, cheap jewelry, and knockoff sunglasses. The sharp scent of hot asphalt mingled with the sweet aroma of caramel corn from a nearby stand. Laughter, horns, hurried footsteps, all of it collided in a relentless rhythm that defined the city at its busiest hour. And there, amid the clamor and the rush, sat David Cole. Perched on the cool stone ledge of a fountain, he blended seamlessly into the forgotten crowd of beggars who haunted the square. His once broad shoulders were slouched beneath the weight of the dull, oversized coat. The sharp lines of his jaw, often accented by a trim beard and impeccable grooming, were now shadowed with stubble. His hands that had signed billion-dollar contracts and held glasses of aged champagne in glittering ballrooms, were now dirtied with the dust of the street. A paper cup rested at his feet, empty, waiting. People rushed by without so much as a glance. Those who did notice let their gaze linger only long enough to scowl, as though his very presence were an inconvenience. A young couple, arms linked, passed with hurried steps. The woman wrinkled her nose as if poverty itself carried a stench. A group of teenagers snickered as they walked past, one of them tossing a coin not into his cup, but at his chest. "Buy yourself some soap." The boy jeered, laughter trailing after him like smoke. David's chest tightened. He had always known. The world was cruel, but experiencing it from this side, the side of invisibility, of disdain, was something he had never imagined. The coin clattered to the ground, rolling toward a storm drain before stopping just out of reach. He did not pick it up. Another passerby tossed a quarter into the cup without slowing. The gesture performed with the same absent-mindedness one might swat a fly. No kindness, no acknowledgement. Just a mechanical motion, as if the poor were nothing more than an obstacle requiring payment to appease their silence. David lowered his gaze, his throat burning with something he could not name. Shame? Rage? Perhaps both. For the first time in his life, he felt the sting of being unseen, not as a man of power or influence, but as someone dismissed, discarded, reduced to a shadow. The sound of footsteps broke his thoughts. Heavy, deliberate, the stride of someone who belonged here, someone important. When David raised his eyes, recognition struck like a bolt. Charles Brandt, a colleague. A man David had once negotiated alongside in lavish boardrooms. Charles was dressed in a tailored navy suit, his gold tie-pin gleaming like the sun. He walked with the confidence of a man accustomed to having doors open before him. David's pulse quickened. For a fleeting moment, he wondered if Charles might recognize him beneath the disguise. Perhaps his experiment would end here. Perhaps Charles, of all people, would pause, see past the rags, and extend his hand. As Charles passed, his eyes flickered briefly toward David, only to harden with disgust. His lips curled in a sneer. "Pathetic," he muttered under his breath, the words slicing through David like a blade. The syllables echoed in David's chest long after. Charles disappeared into the crowd. Pathetic. David swallowed hard, his jaw tightening as he stared at the water spraying from the fountain. He had heard many insults in his life, jealous barbs, whispers of doubt, but never had a single word carried such weight. Never had he felt so diminished, so utterly small. It was as if Charles had not just insulted the beggar he appeared to be, but the man beneath, the soul searching for something real. David pressed his palms together, fingers trembling. He had chosen this disguise, chosen this path, but he had not expected the cruelty to cut so deep, nor the loneliness to echo so loudly. The polished world he had once ruled seemed distant now, almost unreal. And here, in the square where no one cared to look twice, he was forced to face a truth too many already knew. The world does not forgive the poor. Yet, somewhere beneath the ache of rejection, a spark flickered. His disguise was working. He was unseen, unloved, unvalued, and in that void, perhaps he might finally discover who could truly see him. And so, though his chest ached and his heart felt heavy, David whispered once more into the chaos of the square, his voice nearly drowned by the rush of the fountain. If she sees me here, then I'll know. By late afternoon, the roar of the city had begun to soften. The square's frenzy bled into quieter side streets where sunlight filtered gently between brick buildings and cast long golden shadows across the pavement. Here, the rhythm was slower shopkeepers, lowering awnings, mothers guiding their children home, the occasional car rolling past with its windows down. David sat on the edge of a crumbling step, his body weary from the long hours of invisibility. The rags clinging to his frame had grown heavier with each minute, his disguise pressing on him not just physically but deep in his spirit. The fountain's cruel laughter from earlier still echoed in his ears, along with that single word pathetic that Charles Brandt had thrown at him like a curse. His stomach churned with hunger, his lips parched. Yet it was not the lack of food or water that hollowed him most, but the emptiness of being unseen. In his real world, cameras followed him, assistants waited at every door, and even his silence drew attention. But here, on this corner, he could vanish without anyone caring. Until she stopped. She was not the kind of woman who turned heads for her fashion or wealth. Her clothes were simple, a light summer dress patterned with faded blue flowers, her hair tied loosely behind her head. She carried a small paper bag, no doubt groceries from the corner market, and a bottle of water dangled from her hand. She walked with unhurried steps, as though she had nowhere else more important to be. David noticed her gaze before anything else. Unlike the others who passed by with quickened pace or averted eyes, Anna looked at him directly. Not with pity, not with judgment, but with a quiet steadiness that made his chest tighten. "Are you all right?" she asked softly. Her voice was gentle, like a breeze that cools the heat of a long summer's day. David hesitated, unsure of how to respond. For the first time in hours, someone had addressed him not as an obstacle, not as a stain on the sidewalk, but as though he were a man worth answering. His throat ached, but he managed to nod faintly. Anna crouched down to his level, her knees brushing the warm pavement. She pulled a sandwich from her paper bag, its wrapping crinkling as she placed it carefully into his trembling hands. Then, without hesitation, she offered the bottle of water, twisting the cap open first. "Eat," she said simply. "Drink." David stared at the food, his heart thudding. He had dined in the finest restaurants in the world, tasted meals crafted by chefs whose names carried prestige. Yet no meal had ever felt as sacred as this one. With shaking fingers, he raised the bottle to his lips, the cool water spilling. Relief down his throat. He looked up, expecting to find pity in her eyes, but there was none. Only respect. Anna did not speak to him as though he were broken. She asked where he was from, if he liked the weather that day, small questions that held no agenda other than simple conversation. She laughed lightly when he gave short, halting answers, filling the air with warmth. To her, he was not a beggar. He was simply a man sitting on a step, worth talking to, worth noticing. As the sun dipped lower, Anna rose to her feet. She brushed the dust from her dress and adjusted the strap of her bag. "I should go," she said with a kind smile. "But take care of yourself." David's heart clenched at the thought of her leaving. For a moment, he almost broke the illusion, almost told her who he truly was, almost begged her to stay. But before he could speak, she leaned closer, her hand slipped gently into his, pressing something small and folded into his palm. Her touch lingered only for a second, warm and deliberate. Then she turned and walked away, her figure bathed in the amber glow of the fading sun until the crowd swallowed her. David unfolded the note slowly, his hands trembling. On the paper, written in neat handwriting, were 5 words: "You matter more than you think." His throat tightened, his eyes stinging as he stared at the words again and again. It was such a simple message, yet it shattered the wall of silence that had surrounded him all day. Someone had seen him, not the billionaire, not the beggar, but the man in between. And as he sat there, clutching the note like a lifeline, "David, realized that his experiment had taken a turn he never expected. This was not just about finding love. This was about finding humanity. The days that followed unfolded like threads of sunlight weaving through the city's gray fabric. Each afternoon, when the streets softened beneath the waning glow of the sun, David found himself drifting toward the same park. The benches there, weathered, chipped, and worn smooth by countless visitors, became a quiet sanctuary. And without fail she came. Anna. At first, he thought her kindness had been a fleeting act, a moment of grace she would forget as the rush of life reclaimed her. But Anna returned. Again and again, she would arrive with a small paper bag, always carrying something modest: half a sandwich, an apple, sometimes a muffin wrapped in wax paper. She placed the food beside him with the same ease as if she were handing something to an old friend. They would sit side by side beneath the golden light. As the hum of the city softened into the background, David found himself speaking more than he had in years. At first, his words were guarded, short fragments, but Anna had a way of listening that pulled more from him than he intended to share. She laughed at his dry observations, nodded at his silences, and asked questions that felt less like curiosity and more like genuine care. In return, she opened pieces of her own life to him. She told him about the long hours she worked 2 jobs, one at a bookstore during the day, another as a waitress in the evenings. Her voice carried no bitterness, only quiet determination, as she described the exhaustion of balancing both. She spoke of her mother, ill and fragile, whom she cared for every night after work. Her eyes softened when she mentioned her, a love so fierce and unwavering shining through her fatigue. Yet, even in her struggle, Anna laughed often. Sometimes at herself, sometimes at the absurdities of life. Her laughter was light and unrestrained, and it filled the space between them with warmth David hadn't felt in years. Sitting beside her, he admired not just her kindness but her resilience. She carried burdens heavier than many could bear, yet she bore them with grace. He found himself drawn to the strength in her voice, the gentleness of her hands, the sincerity in her gaze. And yet, beneath the growing bond, a weight pressed on David's chest. Each time her eyes met his, he felt the pull to confess, to tell her the truth, that he was not the man she thought, not a beggar living at the mercy of strangers' scraps, but a billionaire who could, with a single decision, erase all of her struggles. But fear held him back. What if revealing his truth shattered the fragile trust they had built? What if she saw his wealth and power first, and the man second? He had lived too long behind masks of influence to risk losing the one person who seemed to see beyond them. So he stayed silent. Instead, he cherished the small rituals that grew between them. The way she always broke her sandwich in half, insisting he take the larger piece. The way she tucked stray strands of hair behind her ear when she was about to share something important. The way she sometimes leaned her shoulder against his when the air grew cooler, as if their closeness was as natural as the setting sun. On one particular evening, as the park bathed in amber light, Anna handed him a small notebook. Its cover was worn, the pages faintly creased. "You said you like stories," she said with a shy smile. "I thought maybe you'd want to write some of your own." David ran his fingers over the cover, the gesture simple but monumental. In that moment, he wanted to tell her everything, that he could buy 1,000 notebooks, build her a library, ensure she never had to work another shift again. But he swallowed the truth, burying it deep. Instead, he whispered, "Thank you." His voice cracked, raw with emotion. Anna smiled, her eyes reflecting the last rays of the sun, and as they sat together on that park bench, sharing food, laughter, and silence, David realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't pretending. He wasn't the billionaire or the beggar. He was simply a man seen, valued, cared for, and he knew, with a certainty that terrified him, that he was falling in love. The afternoons became their rhythm. Each day, as the sun melted into gold and stretched long shadows across the park, David found himself on the same weathered bench. And as if guided by an unspoken promise, Anna would appear. She always brought something simple, half a sandwich wrapped in paper, a bottle of water, sometimes a bruised apple. She placed it between them without ceremony, as though it was the most natural thing in the world. And together they shared not only food but pieces of themselves. David spoke sparingly at first, but Anna had a gift for listening. She leaned in when he spoke, her eyes soft, her nods gentle, her laughter rising at his dry humor in a way that made him feel lighter. She asked questions not out of curiosity, but out of genuine care, as though his answers mattered. And slowly, he began to share more than he ever thought he would in return. She offered glimpses of her own life. She told him of her long hours, days at the bookstore, evenings spent waiting tables. Her voice carried the weariness of someone who had learned to live on little sleep and endless effort, but she never allowed bitterness to creep in. When she spoke of her mother, frail and unwell, her words carried a tenderness that silenced David. The love she bore for her family shone brighter than her exhaustion. Despite the weight she carried, Anna laughed easily. Sometimes it was at her own clumsiness, sometimes at the absurdities of life. Her laughter, bright and unguarded, warmed him in ways his fortune never had. David admired her resilience more with each passing day. She had so little, yet gave so freely: food, time, respect. Sitting beside her, he realized that for the first time in years, he wasn't a man to be feared or envied. He was simply seen. And yet, with every shared moment, his secret pressed heavier on him. He longed to tell her the truth, that he was no beggar, but a billionaire hiding behind rags in search of something real. But fear bound him. What if she looked at him differently? What if the fragile trust between them shattered? One evening, as the light deepened into amber, Anna tilted her head, eyes glinting with quiet curiosity. "You talk like a man who's seen the world," she teased softly, "not just the streets." The words hung between them, half a joke, half a question. David smiled faintly, but inside his heart pounded. She was closer to the truth than she knew. The day of the gathering dawned bright, the kind of day when the sky seemed endless and unbroken, when sunlight kissed the glass towers and bathed the streets in golden brilliance. The community center stood buzzing with anticipation, its courtyard alive with neighbors, city leaders, and curious onlookers. Banners fluttered in the breeze, children laughed in clusters, and the air brimmed with chatter. Anna arrived quietly, her hands tucked into the pockets of her worn cardigan. She hadn't planned to attend, but a friend had insisted. It was said that someone important was unveiling a new foundation for the city. She expected the usual speeches, lofty promises, polite applause, and little change. She had come with no expectations, only to witness. But as she stepped into the hall, her eyes locked onto the stage, and the world tilted beneath her. There, beneath the bright lights, stood David. Not the ragged man she had sat beside on park benches, not the trembling figure clutching half a sandwich, but a man reborn. His frame was wrapped in a charcoal-tailored suit, his shoes polished to a mirror's shine. The ragged beard was trimmed, his posture commanding, his very presence radiating power. He looked nothing like the beggar she thought she knew yet. Everything in his eyes told her it was him. Her breath caught. The announcer's voice echoed through the hall, grand and ceremonious. "Ladies and gentlemen, allow me to introduce one of the most influential leaders in our city, Mr. David Cole." The crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Cameras flashed. Leaders leaned forward in respect. Murmurs rippled through the audience, as whispers of his wealth and empire spread like wildfire. But Anna stood frozen. Her heart pounded as betrayal surged through her veins. Every meal they'd shared, every confession she had trusted him with, every word he had spoken on that park bench, had it all been a lie? She had opened her heart to a man she thought had nothing, only to discover he had everything. And yet, tangled within the sting of betrayal was something else. Awe. He wasn't just a man. He was a force. The rags had fallen away, revealing someone who commanded the attention of an entire city. Still, the memory of his quiet laugh and trembling hands clashed violently with the image before her. David stepped forward, his eyes sweeping the crowd. But they didn't linger on the leaders or the cameras. They found her. Anna's knees nearly buckled under the weight of that gaze. When he spoke, his voice was steady, rich with conviction, carrying into every corner of the hall. For years, I have built an empire. I have known wealth, status, and influence. Yet, in all that time, I have also known loneliness. And so, I made a choice, a secret decision. I walked the streets not as David Cole, billionaire, but as a man stripped of everything. I wanted to know, would anyone see me when I had nothing? The hall grew still. The murmurs hushed. David's words pierced the silence, clear and unyielding. The truest test of love is who stays when you have nothing. The crowd erupted into whispers again, shocked, intrigued, unsettled. But David's gaze never left Anna. It was as though the two of them stood alone in that vast hall, the rest of the world melting into background noise. Anna's chest tightened, her throat dry. He had disguised himself, hidden the truth, tested her heart without her knowing. Anger flared. How dare he deceive her? And yet, beneath the anger, a strange warmth rose. His words weren't for the city, not really. They were for her. Still, her mind raced. Could she trust him again? Could she forgive the deception for what it revealed? Or had the fragile bond they built already fractured under the weight of this truth? David, his hand resting lightly on the podium, waited. The speech would continue, the foundation would be explained, but in that suspended moment, his confession hung in the air like a challenge, and Anna knew her choice would come next. The applause still echoed against the marble walls when Anna rose slowly from her seat. The crowd was a blur of murmuring voices, a sea of curious faces craning to see the woman David's eyes refused to leave. She felt their stares burning into her back as she stepped forward, each step heavier than the last, her pulse thundering in her ears. When she finally reached the stage, she did not see the billionaire in the tailored suit. She saw the man who once shivered on a park bench, his hands wrapped around a paper cup of water she had offered. The man who had listened when she spoke of her mother's failing health. The man who had thanked her, not with wealth or grand gestures, but with the quiet sincerity of someone starved for kindness. Her throat tightened, her lips trembling as she drew closer. The room held its breath, cameras flashing, the audience waiting for scandal or rejection. Instead, Anna's eyes brimmed with tears as she leaned closer, her voice breaking into a whisper meant only for him, though every microphone carried it. Further, I loved the man on the bench, she said, her breath quivering. Not the billionaire on the stage. Gasps swept through the hall like a sudden wind. Some in the crowd shifted uncomfortably. Others leaned in closer, captivated. David's chest rose with a sharp breath, his eyes softening, his shoulders loosening as though the words had struck him deeper than any rejection ever could. For a moment, the mask of power he had carried all his life slipped, revealing the fragile heart beneath. He reached for her hand, not with the entitlement of a man used to possession, but with the quiet plea of someone who still feared losing her. His voice trembled, though it carried strength. Then it was him you truly loved, he said, because that was always me. The audience erupted into whispers again, expecting the story to end here with reconciliation, or perhaps a scandal. But David wasn't finished. He turned back to the podium, still holding Anna's hand in his, and addressed the hall with renewed clarity. For years, I believed my wealth could shield me, that success alone could define my worth. But it wasn't riches that saved me when I walked these streets disguised as a beggar. It was kindness, His voice broke slightly as he glanced at Anna. Her kindness. A silence fell over the hall, thick and reverent. David took a breath, then continued. This is why I stand before you today, not to flaunt wealth, not to build another empire, but to give back. I am establishing the Cole Foundation for the Forgotten. Its mission, to provide shelter, education, and dignity to those who are invisible in our city. To the ones mocked, ignored, cast aside, just as I once was. His words carried weight, not from grandeur, but from truth. He gestured to Anna, his grip on her hand unwavering. And I will not do this alone. Anna has shown me what it means to truly see someone. Her compassion was the spark that brought me here. That's why I'm asking her, not just to stand with me in love, but to co-lead this mission. To make this her fight as much as mine. The hall erupted not in scandalous whispers this time, but in applause, louder than before, echoing with something deeper than admiration. It was respect. Anna's breath caught. She had not expected this, not an offer of diamonds, not the promise of riches, but a call to purpose. To transform her quiet acts of compassion into something that could ripple through the lives of thousands. Tears spilled freely down her cheeks as she turned to David, searching his face for any trace of deception. There was none. Her lips parted, trembling with the weight of the choice before her. To walk away would be easier, safer, free from scrutiny. But to accept meant stepping into a life bigger than herself, one shaped not by comfort, but by courage. And, as the crowd roared, Anna realized she already had her answer. Evening descended gently over the city, painting the sky with streaks of amber and violet. The grand opening of the Cole Foundation for the Forgotten had ended hours earlier, yet the courtyard outside the center still hummed with life. Children darted about with plates of warm food in their hands, their laughter spilling into the night air like music. Volunteers handed out blankets and books. The scent of fresh bread mingled with the sweetness of roasted corn, drifting into the crowd of families who had come seeking shelter, hope, and dignity. David stood at the edge of it all, his once polished shoes now dusty from walking among the people. Beside him, Anna's hand was clasped tightly in his own, their fingers interwoven like roots of an old tree. The light from the foundation's tall windows glowed across her face, and for a moment, he thought she looked like the very embodiment of the hope they had promised to bring. Together, they watched a little boy in a tattered shirt grin as he received his first proper meal of the week. His small shoulders shook with laughter when another child offered to share a piece of bread. The sight pierced David's chest, a memory flashing. Unbidden, the cold sting of the fountain stone beneath him, the shame in strangers' eyes as they tossed coins at his feet. He felt Anna's hand squeeze his gently, grounding him in the present. "You've given them more than food tonight," she whispered softly, her voice trembling with quiet awe. "You've given them a chance to believe they matter." David turned to her, his throat tightening. "No," he murmured, his gaze steady. "We did this. You were the first person who looked at me and saw more than what I appeared to be. You gave me back my own worth." Her eyes shimmered in the dim light, and she leaned her head against his shoulder. Around them, the joyous chaos of children. Continued clapping games, bursts of laughter, the shuffle of shoes against stone. It was imperfect, but it was alive. It was hope incarnate. For David, the skyscrapers that once defined his empire now seemed hollow compared to this moment. Wealth had built walls. Compassion was tearing them down. He realized then that the greatest legacy he could leave was not in towers of glass or numbers in a ledger, but in the lives touched by a meal, a lesson, a smile. As the evening deepened, one little girl approached. She held a paper in her hands, a shaky drawing of two figures holding hands beside a tall building. She pressed it into David's palm with a shy smile. "This is you and her," she said, pointing at Anna. "You're helping us. So I drew you a home. David's chest tightened as tears blurred his vision. Anna bent down, kissed the girl's forehead, and whispered, "Thank you, sweetheart. This is the most precious gift we could ever receive." When the child scampered off, David unfolded the drawing again, his thumb tracing the crayon lines. It was simple, imperfect, but to him it was a symbol. He had once clung to appearances, but now a child's faith was the measure of his worth. He looked at Anna, his voice hushed yet filled with conviction. "Love that sees past appearances," he said, recalling her words, "is the rarest treasure." Of all, Anna smiled through her tears, nodding. "And true greatness, it's never in fortune. It's in compassion shared." They stood together, watching the courtyard glow with laughter and hope, the night alive with promise. Around them, stories were being rewritten, destinies altered not by wealth, but by kindness. David knew, without doubt, that it had all begun with a single act, a woman handing bread and water to a man she thought was invisible. And in that truth lay the greatest lesson of all: small acts of kindness, no matter how fragile or fleeting, hold the power to reshape the future in ways no one could ever predict. As the stars emerged above the city, David and Anna remained side by side, hands still clasped, hearts bound not by power or riches, but by the unshakable force of compassion. And for the first time, David felt not like a billionaire or a beggar, but simply, wholly, a man who had finally found home.